Who is Gilgamesh? Gilgamesh is one of the most famous mythological characters in all the world, in part because of the documents that chronicle his exploits and adventures, as well as his connection to real kings of Sumeria. This character comes to us from what we would call Sumerian mythology, but in part some history. He is classified by the mythology as being a semi-divine creature, being of both human origin and divine origin. His celestial origin, which we usually talk about, we would attribute the Sumerians to the Theban star system, but Gilgamesh seems to be a product of not only that line, but also an earth line. So I do believe his abode was Earth. And his period of rulership or worship was during the second millennium BCE, from approximately 2800 to 2500 BCE. He is most often associated with royalty, kingship, the Sumerian kings list, as well as adventure and strength. His predecessors per the Sumerian kings list would be Demi, the fisherman, and he would be succeeded by his own son, Uruk. His symbols were the bull or the lion, and his parentage, which stays somewhat murky, is attributed to the goddess Ninsun and Lugalbanda, who is a male god. And of course, he would produce Uruk as his offspring. And again, the Epic of Gilgamesh is possibly the oldest of its kind that was ever discovered. And there were 5 tablets that chronicle his adventures, and we'll talk about those. But early in the first tablet, he is introduced as being 2/3 divine and 1/3 immortal, which is an odd way to divide that. Now, if we look at the lineage for the Sumerian deities, both of his parents seem to be of the same line, both being descendants of An. And so never would we see the insertion of human DNA. We see 2 beings who are firmly in that Sumerian list of deities, both of which would have been divine. So how he becomes 1/3 human is never really explained. But very early in the poem about Gilgamesh, he is described as being a brutal and oppressive ruler. And this is interpreted in 2 ways, either him compelling his subjects to engage in forced labor, or that he was sexually oppressing his subjects. And this is the interpretation that I had heard early on, that Gilgamesh would see a woman or a male, and if he felt the desire, he would take that person, and there was no one who could stop him. He was such a strong individual. And we will talk more about the outcome of that as well. The tales of Gilgamesh's legendary exploits are narrated in 5 remaining or surviving Sumerian poems. The earliest of which is Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld, in which Gilgamesh travels to the underworld to aid the goddess Inanna, who is being assaulted by creatures attacking her sacred tree. As a reward for their help, she gives the king 2 unknown objects, which are called a Miku and Piku, which he summarily loses. The second poem is Gilgamesh and Aga, which describes his revolt against his then overlord and king. Yet another poem describes Gilgamesh's epic defeats of Umbaba and the Bull of Heaven, while the last poem describes his death and his funeral. He is most remembered for his epic adventures, and this is something that Gilgamesh was very confident and conscious of the entire time. Before he slays Umbaba, he goes through a bit of a reckoning. He had been a very oppressive king, and his people appealed to the gods that he was too harsh, and they wanted the gods to intervene. So the gods created, again, these are Anunnaki gods. We do understand their tendency for genetic manipulation. They do attribute the creation of the Lulu, or man, as genetic experiment, slicing their DNA with primate DNA. So they create this creature called Enkidu, who would be a match for Gilgamesh. And he was raised in the wild, and he had a great connection to the creatures of the forest. So in order to tame him, they sent a prostitute, Shamash, to him. And he spent many days with her and enjoyed the embrace of this beautiful woman. And he was tame. And so he went to the city, and he saw Gilgamesh and how he treated his people, and he stood against him. And Gilgamesh had never had a man stand before him. He never had encountered anyone who could, because of his great strength. But Enkidu proved to be an equal match, and the two wrestled and fought into a standstill. But they would later become friends, because Gilgamesh developed such a great respect for Enkidu. On his continued quest to immortalize his name, Gilgamesh came up with the idea of slaying Umbaba, who was the guardian of the cedar forest and the home of the gods. And he is quoted as saying, "I will cut down the tree. I will kill Umbaba. I will make a lasting name for myself. I will stamp my fame on men's minds forever." And this comes from tablets 93 to 94 of the Gilgamesh epics. And we remember that Humbaba himself was a divine creature of great power who was feared, who had the head of a lion or that of a goat, who breathed fire, whose roar was like thunder. But he saw value in being able to claim defeat of this creature. So he and Enkidu depart on this adventure and indeed slay the great Umbaba. And on his way back home, they encounter the goddess Inanna, who is in love with Gilgamesh, who admires him and wants to take him as a lover. And the interesting thing about this is if we look back at the family tree of the Sumerian deities, Inanna is positioned that she was probably his great aunt in this scenario. But he rejects her, not for that reason alone, but because he cites that she's often very cruel to all of her lovers, and they always seem to fall misfortune after falling into her bed. Angry at the rejection, she goes back to her father, An, and asks that the bull of heaven be unleashed upon earth as a penance for her slight or her rejection at the hands of Gilgamesh. So the bull of heaven is released and causes chaos until the bull is confronted by Gilgamesh and his great friend Enkidu. The two powerful creatures were able to slay the bull, but the gods decree that one of them must die because of the slight to Inanna and the destruction of the bull of heaven. And they choose to make it Enkidu. And Enkidu is poisoned and suffers a very long and painful death that Gilgamesh witnesses firsthand, which launches the last component of who Gilgamesh really is, and that was his quest for immortality. He was always fighting for this, which is interesting. The way that they define Gilgamesh, him being either semi-divine or fully divine, wouldn't matter. Him being semi-divine means he was not going to be immortal. He wanted to live in the home of the gods, and this may be the reason that he ultimately attacked Umbaba, who was guarding the cedar forest that was sacred to the gods. So his quest for immortality falls short, and ultimately Gilgamesh succumbs like every other living creature that we've seen on Earth. But he leaves obviously an indelible mark on mythology and culture around the world. He is not actively worshipped by any of us. He has never been in a Marvel movie, but yet many of us will hear the name Gilgamesh and hear the story of the great epic that's centered around him. He was never a sympathetic character. He showed great flaws as a person who oppressed not only his people but those around him. He attacked nature. He chopped down a forest that was sacred, and there was no reason to chop it down. But this is who Gilgamesh was. He was a mix of these deities, the Sumerians, who oftentimes themselves showed to be petty or small. And he was of humans who have shown those same failings in great numbers. Conversations about Gilgamesh obviously open up more conversations about other divine creatures. And we can find divine creatures in other mythologies. I would submit that Hercules of Greek myth was a semi-divine, as well as Thor of Assyrian mythology. So we see that riddled throughout mythology is this idea of the mating between divine and mortals. We also have to speak about his relationship with Inanna. I have done a profile if you want to take a look at that, but describes her position in this world. And she was a character that was not often a righteous representation either. And we see a lot of that from the Sumerian deities. We have a great story about Umbaba, who I've done a profile on as well. And it's important to understand who Umbaba was and what he stood for, as well as a representation of cedar and the cedar forest, which you can also find in our library. And it is the slaying of the bull of heaven that captures my attention next. If we want to understand not only the primaries, but we want to understand the ancillary characters in mythologies, because their roles can often tell us a lot about what the primaries' motivation were or was. So thank you for stopping in at Nile Chronicles. Hopefully you've enjoyed this brief introduction into who Gilgamesh is. It is important that you research some of the literature, and the Gilgamesh epics are readily available in book form or in PDF, but please always stop by here and enjoy some of the content that we've produced for your enjoyment. Please remember to like and subscribe, and thank you for stopping in at Nile Chronicles.